Hello, everyone, and welcome to the continuation of the MMO class. Can I say, Nelson, to you? Finally.
Yeah, I know.
But hey, do you know what? The new site is functioning. It's doing great. We just need to get that dark theme going. Hint, hint, hint. Oh, yeah, that's right. We've got lots of stuff to worry about. We'll deal with that later. But it is nice that the MMO class is once again continuing, and the way that we're going to be moving forward with this is offering it as an online class for the time being. You guys will have the ability to jump in, to ask questions, to contribute. And as we have always said with the MMO since the very early days, this is not lecture. I mean, there's going to be a lecture, but I mean, it's not like a pre-planned class. I mean, the MMO has never been something that we've sat down and designed out and then prepared a syllabus from it and then turned around and taught it. Now, there have definitely been plenty of videos that we have produced that have come across that way. But, I mean, once again, the concept was always to be that of a camera over the shoulder watching what we are doing. By offering this as a participation style live class, this gives you guys the ability, if you want, to join in. And if something is, very bizarre that's going on or very technical that you have questions about, you can ask questions now, which is excellent. Yeah, and I really encourage you guys to take advantage of that. It's nothing more frustrating than students that join us in some of the more advanced classes, and then they just sit there, they never ask a question, and then class gets over, and then I end up hearing, or somebody ends up seeing on the forums, them going, "Oh, that was horrible. I didn't understand anything." How many questions did you ask? I didn't ask any questions. I didn't want to. Ask questions. I mean, you'll be surprised how much you'll pick up by asking questions, because then you'll start understanding. So, yeah, again, there is no outline ahead. What we're going to be doing is going forward with, I think Nelson's wanting to start just to get things warmed back up and going before jumping back into the CGS. I believe you wanted to start with RuneSlinger, correct?
Yeah, just a nice little basic game to kind of get us going, kind of get back in the swing of working with Photon and Unity. I will actually be installing both Photon and Unity here on screen because I don't have those installed yet on this installation of Windows. So it's going to be an adventure for everybody.
Did you already download them?
Yes, I do have them all downloaded.
Oh, that's good.
So, yeah, is there anything more you wanted to go over, Jason?
No, not really. Wolf Nightly wants to know if I can join in and start teaching. Sure, Wolf. Let's just hand the mic over to him and we'll drink some coffee. Just kidding.
Well, Danko asks how we're going to be handling the UI for RuneSlinger. And at first, the great thing about RuneSlinger is it's a very simple game. Lee spent a lot of time working on client-side stuff with terrain generations and all that stuff. I'm taking a kind of opposite approach where I'm going to be working on server-side stuff to begin with. So that means that the client isn't going to be a massive concern, even once we get into implementing the client to be fully functional. As far as what we'll be building the interface in, we'll just be using the basic Unity stuff for now until we get to the point where we'll be looking at CGS. And I've been working with another developer on taking a look at CGS, getting some bugs ironed out, adding in some more features, and potentially even moving away from having CGS use Unity's UI system as the backbone, because that seems to be causing some problems. Because Unity's UI is...
I can say that is one of the darn cool things about CGS now, is that even though there's been a break taken from it with getting the website up and going, CGS has been used in an actual commercial production environment now, and we've received some great feedback. Some bugs have been located that Nelson had in the original implementation. So, yeah, that's actually pretty exciting.
Yep. So, yeah. Okay, so if people want to hang out, there's this place called BuzzNet. So I just want to point this out because I'm sure there's quite a few people here who haven't really been members for very long or haven't really seen our live classes. If you jump over to buzznet.3dbuzz.com, log in with your 3D Buzz credentials, your username and password, to hit join, connect to the class, you'll be able to participate in this just chat room with other people. I noticed there's a very large discrepancy between the amount of people in the webinar and the amount of people in BuzzNet. So, okay, so to get things started, what I'm going to do is install Unity and Photon. I do have them all downloaded, and while this stuff goes ahead and downloads or installs, I'm going to show everybody where I grabbed this stuff. Hopefully everybody already has Unity installed, actually, so probably should have.
But you don't need to show them where to grab it. They're here. They should know where to get it from.
Yeah, you guys should know where to get Unity from. But Photon. What is Photon? Photon is at a website that I didn't have the forethought to already navigate to.
Exit Games.
Exit Games. And what it is it's a server platform for creating game servers. It's just a server platform. It's a server that handles communication, reliability and security of communication, and all that fun stuff. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be building an application inside of Photon, which is just going to be a normal .NET project that's compiled into an assembly that's loaded by by Photon's runtime, and then that will allow us to communicate with Unity. So what you need to do to grab Photon is first you need to sign up. You're going to have to create an Exit Games account with this awesome sign-up form that is completely blank. I don't know.
I see all the fields. You don't see them?
What? No?
That's what you.
So once you do that somehow, hopefully the registration form actually appears for you guys. What you guys are going to need to do is grab the SDK. In this case, I grabbed the executable. Apparently now Photon comes in an executable with an executable installer, so that's going to be fun to. Previously, you had to unzip it somewhere on your computer and blah blah blah. Now it has an installer, so hopefully that will be lots of fun and easier setup than it previously was. So you're going to want to grab the server SDK, and then you're going to want to grab the Unity client. And you'll also notice that Photon has clients for pretty much everything. We have Android, BlackBerry, just straight up .NET, Flash, iOS, JavaScript, macOS, Marmalade. Don't know what that is. Mono for Android, blah, blah, blah. I wonder, actually, Rowdy Bull, are there NuGet packages for Photon? I should actually check that out when we get to actually creating the project after my Unity installs. Probably should have installed that beforehand. I didn't realize it would take this long. But anyway, so go ahead and grab Photon because that's what we're going to be starting off with. Today, the plan is just to get everything installed, configured, help people out who might be having problems, and then get a basic sort of ping-pong type, not Pong as in the game, but ping and pong as in sending information, receiving information to and from the client. Yeah, so that's going to kind of be the goal for today. I do want to point out that because of the unstructured nature of this class, I am going to be keeping it to 2 hours, because if we don't keep it to 2 hours, potentially it could go on forever. So I just want to point that out. So although I'll have an idea about what we want to cover or what I want to do in the class beforehand, I will be having a hard limit of 2 hours just to make sure that the class ends within everybody's lifetime.
I like what Matthew said. So a class from the MMO and Unity going on forever? What's the issue? Well, the last time I taught a 7-8 hour class and it was 3 o'clock in the morning, Matthew, I lost just almost everyone, including you, I think. No, yeah, you did stay to the end. You and Pencil, that was pretty much it. That's true. Continue.
The last time we talked on the MMO, we kind of shouted at each other. Yeah, I remember that. Okay, so I just went ahead and installed Unity, so let's install Photon. Now, I don't know what's going to happen when I click on this. You guys see that? This is probably the first step. If you are running Windows 8 and you ever see a message like this, go ahead and right-click the executable, hit Properties, and then hit the yes, I really did intentionally download and I really do want to actually install this software, please let me button called in block. So then hit OK and run it. So it's asking me to extract. Now, is it extracting the installer or is it extracting a Photon installation? I'm going to assume that's extracting a Photon installation, so I'm going to dump it where I should dump it on my hard drive, which is going to be under my aptly named storage drive under software. And I'm just going to stick it under here. And I don't know if it's going to include... this is horrible. I'll just assume that it's not going to include a root folder. So I'm going to just call it Photon. What version is this? Photon v328. Click OK, hit extract, and let's see what happens. Like I said, I've never used their installer before. Turns out it's not really much of an installer if it's all it's doing is extracting files. So that was very anticlimactic. I was expecting like a wizard that would actually set things up for me, but instead all it did was dump files on my hard drive. So now that I've dumped those files on my hard drive, let's jump over into this. And fortunately, yes, I did make the correct call. It's going to just dump them directly into what folder that you have selected. So go ahead and get that extracted somewhere on your hard drive. I should have enough room for
Good heavens, I saw a lot of red there. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's just because I'm pretty much full.
Hey, your DVD drive's pretty empty.
DVD drive. Oh yeah, I ended up having to plug that thing back in. I accidentally unplugged it like 2 years ago, and then I just finally realized I had it unplugged a couple months ago. So that's how often I use my optical drive. Alrighty, so let's look at Photon. I know this isn't supposed to really be a lecture, but I'm guessing people are here to actually, well, learn stuff. So let's go over what Photon is. I'm going over basically off memory at this point because, again, I haven't installed Photon for a good while now. So we have our deploy folder. This is our application. So this is, well, not our application, but this is the application that you would want to place onto a production box if you were to want to deploy your program. Then we have doc, which should be pretty straightforward documentation. You can go through all the configuration options and stuff like that. I've spent a lot of time in these PDFs in the past, and I'll probably end up referring to them today at some point. We have lib. These are the assemblies that we are going to be referencing in our server application. So remember how I said the server application is really just a class library or just an assembly, a DLL file that we place into Photon. Then Photon's responsible for actually taking our assembly, loading it up into its runtime, and having it do its thing. This is the folder where we get all of the assemblies that our server is going to have to reference. Then we have source server, which just has example projects that you can look through. So we have things like Light and Light Lobby. This is some sort of weird pseudo framework thingy that they bundle with Photon. We have MMO, which contains some more fun stuff for things like interest management, all that stuff. We're not basing our project off either Light Lobby or MMO. So I just want to point that out. And for Rune Game, we're not going to be worrying about load balancing. That's sort of that's a concern that's going to obviously come up during the development of the MMO. But again, the idea is that this project is going to be simple, straightforward, and will allow us to play with Photon finally. All right, so under the deploy folder, this is the folder you're going to care about the most. Bin tools will include a little file or program that you guys should be not necessarily familiar with, but at least either have your own log tailing application or use Beartail in here. So if I ever refer to Beartail, that's a program within bin tools. However, I will be using my own favorite log viewer for this. Because keep in mind, Photon is headless. That means that Photon does not have a user interface. The only way to know what's going on with Photon is to watch logs. So if you plan on working with Photon, you will be watching logs a lot. What is load balancing? Load balancing is to where you may have a server or a cluster of servers that all take on different responsibilities or take on the same responsibilities but different sectors of those responsibilities in order to balance the load that your application might have on a server. So the folders we care about, we don't care about the light lobby, load balancing, MMO demo, or policy. In fact, I'm going to be deleting these here very shortly. What we do care about are these binary folders. The Win32, Win32XP, Win64, Win64XP, they're all the same stuff, just different builds of Photon. Because I am running Windows 8 64-bit, I'm going to be using bin Win64. And I don't know why they still provide XP installations. Does anybody still use XP?
I'm sure.
I mean, that's just sad. Alrighty, so inside of this, we have a few bat files or CMD files that are very important. We have our run Photon as application, start and stop, service install, service start, service stop, service uninstall. I'm going to be running Photon primarily as an application. So what I want to do is I want to use this little photoncontrol.exe. This photoncontrol.exe is this fun little program that puts a little tray icon on your computer and allows you to control Photon. Because this computer that you're looking at is my desktop that I use for desktop-y type things. It's my workstation that I use for work type things. I have a million different servers and stuff like that installed on this computer. I like to have control over when things start and stop. So I'll be using the Photon control. In fact, I'm going to be using it so often that I'm going to drag it onto my taskbar and I'm going to dump it into my development bin. And if you guys don't know what bins are, you really should look it up and buy that program because it's really nice. So let's see what happens when I fire up Photon. So I just launched the Photon control, and the first thing it's going to tell me is no license file was found, limiting the number of concurrent users to 20. Give me one sec as I rearrange my system tray. I don't want you, I don't want you, I don't want you, nor you, or you, or you. So what I need to do is I need to go ahead and dump my license file into the binary folder that I'm going to be using. In this case, my binary folder is the bin Win64. The license file can be retrieved on the Photon download page, which I moved over to another monitor, and it's just under the free licenses. Now, Photon has a free developer license, or actually, it's not a developer license, it's also a commercial license that allows you to have 100 concurrent connections without an expiration. Then it also has a trial license that gives you unlimited concurrent connections, but it has a 30-day limit. I've already grabbed my free license, so I'm going to jump over into my horribly cluttered downloads folder and find it. So it's this guy right here, and I'm just going to dump it right into the binary folder. And now Photon will just pick that up for me. So that's nice of it. Now I'm going to go ahead and try to actually start Photon and see what happens. So I'm going to click on this little system tray doohickey guy that was launched because I ran the Photon launcher. And I'm going to take a look at it changed a little bit. I'm going to go under Photon control. That doesn't do what I want. Photon instances, default. I'm going to go ahead and say start as application. Now, when you do that, nothing's going to happen as far as you can tell, but what it did was it started up this log folder. Keep in mind, you will be looking at logs a lot because Photon is headless. The only way to know what's going on with your Photon instance is to look at logs. So I'm going to fire up my little log viewer, Log Fusion, which I highly recommend people get, and I'm going to clear out these two logs. And I'm going to dump these files over here, and I'm going to see what's going on. And what's going on is, fortunately, we got a services running. So you notice that's down here at the bottom. That's good. That means that my all my firewall stuff is configured right. That means that there's no other application listening on the ports that Photon defaults to. Typically, if you have a fresh installation of Photon and you get an error when you try to launch it, that means that some other application is bound to the ports that Photon tries to bind to. Now, I believe the default configuration of Photon is going to try to bind to 1,000,001 different ports, and I'm going to actually go through the configuration here in a moment and, well, play with some of the settings, stop it from launching things like MMO demo and light and all that stuff, because I don't really care about those applications. And by removing applications from being started up, makes the Photon startup a lot faster. So let's talk about Photon configuration. So now Photon's running. I can have applications connect to Photon, even though I haven't really told Photon to do anything specific, so I don't have my own server yet in Photon, so Photon's just kind of sitting there doing what it does without any special instruction from me. So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to jump into this photonserver.config file. So I'm going to open that up, and then I'm going to tell Sublime Text to render this as XML, and now I have Photon. So you're going to be spending a lot of time in this file. It's good to understand what this file is, and it looks like looks fairly similar to what it did before. It just looks a little bit less complicated, actually. There's fewer elements than I remember. Don't know what that master thing is. Applications, default light. Okay, so that's under the load balancing instance. I don't care about load balancing. We're not going to be using that, obviously. I'll just leave that in there just because I don't want to break anything too terribly. But what's important is up here, we have our UDP listeners and our TCP listeners. These will give you the ports that we're going to be having to use to communicate with Photon. So in the case of UDP, we have 5055, which UDP is the protocol we're going to be using for Rune Game, and then for TCP we have 4530. So these are the two ports that are going to be the most important things to make sure that are clear on your system before launching Photon, or Photon will fail to bind to the ports. We also have IP addresses, which will allow us to control which one of our Ethernet adapters Photon binds to. This is a lot more important for a server environment than a development environment. Leaving these to 0000 is fine for development. So we have a bunch of stuff. Now, applications. So, as I said before, Photon is kind of this big runtime that kind of sits around on your computer. If you're familiar with a web server like Apache or IIS, it's a very similar concept. Within Photon, you have applications, and applications are, well, they're applications that run inside of that runtime. So I don't want any of these guys. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to comment all of this stuff out. That should make the startup times a little bit more fast. But I'm going to leave them in for now just because I'll be copying and pasting these here shortly. Now keep in mind that by removing all of these guys, I've just resulted in the Photon application not being able to start because I've told it to default to the light application, and I've, well, removed the configuration for the light application. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and fire up a new Visual Studio project and, well, I guess get things going, jump back into the configuration, talk about how we can get Photon to load up our application and actually see about getting some code running. So I'm going to fire up Visual Studio, and then I'm going to sneakily fire up Visual Studio and point it to the source code of the old Rune game I wrote a year ago. Oh, monitor, go away, this way. And Visual Studio being notoriously fast at loading. Open project. Hold on, I know I'm off screen, but you know what? This isn't over the shoulder.
Not only
look,
that,
so.
well, go ahead. In just a minute, I'm going to have you do one other thing.
Oops, I launched the wrong project. So is that Jason?
I'll have you
want
go
me
in
to do?
just a minute.
I'll have you code in just a minute.
Okay. Any idea why I can't start Photon as application? The option is not activated. Did you install it as a service, maybe? I don't know. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project. Now, the project type that I'm going to be creating is under Templates, Other Project Types, Visual Studio Solutions. So I'm creating a solution. This solution is going to contain our server code, our shared code between our client and our server, and some client code that can be written in isolation of Unity. So, as far as where I'm going to dump it, how about under 3D Buzz? Actually, I can't do that because I already have another project. So I'm going to create a new folder called MMO, which of course I have. So I'm going to dump it in here, and I'm going to name the solution Rune Slinger. And I'm pretty sure that's spelled right, but there we go. I can see myself making a mistake in the solution name and then perpetuate that spelling mistake through the entirety of the application. It's happened before. Okay, so projects. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to create a class library. And I just realized, I don't know if Photon has a .NET 4.5 runtime or a .NET 4 runtime. So again, I said this was going to be an adventure, so let's assume that it's going to run on .NET 4.5, so I'm going to select that as my version of .NET. I'm going to jump over to Windows, jump over to Class Library, and I'm going to create a class library. This solution is going to fill out quite a bit throughout the development of RuneSlinger. Obviously, this can contain most of the code, but I'm just going to start off with the one project that's going to be placed within Photon just to get us started. So, RuneSlinger.server is what I'm going to name this project. And so I get this class 1, which I'm going to delete. Now, the first thing I need to do is I need to pull in the server SDK. And somebody mentioned earlier NuGet, and I wonder if Photon has a NuGet package. And it does not. So, this project is going to be under source control. So I am going to go ahead and fix up my paths just a little bit. I'm going to close out of Visual Studio, go into my solution folder under RuneSlinger. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this Visual Studio. Then I'm going to dump everything that I just had Visual Studio generate into a folder called Visual Studio. Then I'm going to create another folder called lib. Inside of lib, I'm going to create a folder called Photon Server, inside of which I'm going to copy over all of my libraries that I have that I'm going to need to reference from the Photon server. Those can be found wherever you installed Photon, so in this case right here, under lib. The ones I want, if I remember correctly, I'm going to grab the DLLs, and I'm also going to grab the PDBs for all these as well, in case we get an exception and I want to see a nice stack trace. I'm going to grab exit game libs, grab log for net. Don't know if I need ionic.zip. We'll find out later. Grab photon socket server.dll and its PDB. And then photon 3. I don't think I actually need that. That's a client library if I'm not mistaken. I need the host runtime interfaces, and that's about it. So I'm going to copy these over to the lib folder. Can anybody tell me why I'm copying these over into the lib folder instead of referencing them directly in my Photon installation? Anyone? Come on, is anybody awake?
The password is MMO time, right, Nelson?
The password is MMO time, right, Nelson?
Okay.
Yes. With
TB
time
capital.
being capital. Yeah. Yep, Rowdy Bull got it. So it's all about source control. The fact is, another developer might have a Photon installation that is somewhere else on their computer. In fact, it's very likely that they will. So I need to copy all my libraries in directly in order for them to be carried along with my repository. Once I get that repository created, which I'll do after we get something actually working. So then I'm going to jump back into my root folder of the project, jump into the Visual Studio folder, jump into the SLIN. Once I load the SLIN, I'm going to reference those files, and then I'm going to do one more thing to ensure that this won't break when I add it to source control. So we fired up Visual Studio, I'll add those references in, add reference, browse, that's totally the wrong folder. MMO dev class, RuneSlinger, lib, Photon server, and I'm going to add in all these DLLs that I copied over into that file, or that folder, hit add, hit OK. Now I'm going to do one more thing, and this thing is probably going to terrify everybody, but get used to it. I'm going to right-click on runeslinger.server, I'm going to hit unload project, then I'm going to right-click back on it, hit edit the CS proj, and I'm going to ensure that Visual Studio wasn't an idiot and added in absolute paths into my hint path, and it wasn't. So basically, every single reference that you might ever add to a project is going to have a hint path, or most of them will anyway, if they're not in the GAC. The hint path is going to just give Visual Studio, or MS Build more appropriately, the location of the library. You want to make sure that these are relative, because if they are not relative, they will break if you move this solution over to a different developer computer who doesn't have the same folder structure as me. So now I've verified that the hint paths didn't get messed up. I think Visual Studio is getting better at that. In the past, it always used to screw up the hint paths, but it seems nowadays it's a lot better at that. I'm going to right-click back on this, hit reload project, which will get the project loaded up, and I'm going to create a class. So basically, you can think of your Photon application as having an entry point, just as a console application would or a WinForms application would. And that entry point is just a class that inherits from a particular type that's available from some of these, or one of these assemblies that I've previously referenced. And if I can go ahead and actually remember what that type is, we can keep going.
And before you start back up, I do want to jump in real quick, Nelson. Now, since you're the one who scheduled the MMO in the webinar system, right? Okay. I don't know.
I think, no, it was Nina.
I don't know what details were left or added or not added, because this is, I mean, we've got a really large class right now, but we've had 2 students that were unable to find the password, and after class is over, I'll send you one of them who sent who has a screenshot that says this sucks. So if you want to spend just a moment and talk about that, and again, I don't know if the details were not in the actual description of the class. I mean, in the past, I've always scheduled everything, and that's where I put the details, and we don't generally have this kind of problem, but this time around we've got a couple of agitated people. Though, like I said, I mean, we've got a large class with a lot of new names. People are finding the password somewhere, but could you spend just a minute and talk about where people will be able to find password and things like that? For those that have not been involved with classes before, plus you've also got your new site design in place.
Sure. Well, if you go to the website and enroll in the class, which was outlined in the thread, I'm going to jump over into live classes, MMO development. Make sure that you've enrolled. So right now it says dropout because I'm technically enrolled in the class, but make sure that you've enrolled in the class. I did specify this on the thread, in the thread that described the MMO class. Once you've enrolled, when a password gets sent or set up for a particular session, you will get a notification about that. And there we go. So I did get a notification saying that the password for live class session getting started up for development has been posted, in which case you can click on that and you'll be sent to a page that has the password. Alternatively, just like in the old system, you can jump over to the live class calendar, and and if you click on the individual session that you want to see the password for, and it has been posted, you will get back to the same page. So just make sure that you're actually enrolled in the class, in which case you will get a notification when the password has been posted. Or you can do what people have been doing in the past, which is just sit on the live class calendar, wait for the password to be posted. Either way, again, you'll get a notification if you're enrolled. And only
But for those of you that have made it into the class now, I apologize that it was a bit of a headache, and we'll come up with a way of making it even more in your face, more easier. All right, apologies to everyone for interrupting. I just wanted to go over that real quick. I do believe we've got everybody joining us now. So, continue.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a class, and that class is going to inherit from another class called Application Base. Because I have a vast amount of creativity and imagination, I'm going to call this class Application. Seems like a pretty straightforward name for what we're trying to do. And I'm going to have it inherit Application Base. Then I'm going to tell it to implement the 3 required members of this class. So this class has 3 abstract members that we have to implement. Now, 2 of these methods should be very straightforward. We have setup and teardown. Setup is invoked by Photon when our application is launched. Teardown is invoked by Photon when our application ends. One of them isn't so obvious. We have this create peer method. In Photon, you have what are called peers, and a peer is simply an object that represents a connection to a client. Now, what we need to do is we need to create a class that actually inherits from the peer base class, and we need to pass it into as a return of the invocation of create peer. Every time a peer is created or a client connection happens, Photon will invoke this method, and that gives us the opportunity to pass back our own instantiation of our own type that inherits from peer base. Now you'll notice that Photon will pass in this structure called init request. Init request has a bunch of fun little things in it, things like connection ID, local IP, local port, which tells us which Ethernet adapter, virtual or otherwise, the client connected to, gives us the Photon peer, which is the kind of the base type for Photon's peerness, then gives us our remote IP and remote port. So fairly straightforward. However, in order to actually fill this method up with anything, we have to create a class that inherits from peer base. And again, just back to my awesome naming convention, I'm going to call this, how about Rune Peer? Let's mix things up a little bit. And then he's going to inherit from peer base, which doesn't necessitate that I actually implement anything inside of this, with the exception of, obviously, the constructor and the other types methods that I completely forgot about. So I just lied to everybody. So the Rune Peer, the peer base class, if I jump into the actual class, and Visual Studio went white for a second for some reason, has a fancy little constructor that requires we pass in a IRPC protocol type or argument and an iPhoton peer argument. Now, the great thing about this, and I don't know why it requires that we pass in both of them, but what we can do instead is we can just accept an init request, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to change this constructor to accept an init request, and then when I pass into the base constructor, I'm just going to do init request dot protocol, and then init request dot photon peer. So that will just simplify my constructor a little bit. Now, we have the on-operation request and on-disconnect. On-disconnect should be fairly straightforward again. Just specifies that's just Photon telling us that the client has disconnected. The on-operation request is a little bit more fun, though. This is going to be invoked whenever the client tells our server to do something. So this is basically the spot where we put in our custom logic that allows our client to communicate with our server. So now that I have this class created, I can jump back over into application, and instead of returning null on create peer, I can return a new instantiation of Rune Peer, passing in my fancy little init request, which will satisfy the base constructor of the peer base class. So the final thing I'm going to do here, just to get things kind of going, is I'm going to get some logging kind of set up, or no, I'm not going to worry about that. We're about 10 minutes away from break, so what I do want to see is I want to see this application actually being put into Photon and having Photon spool up our program. What you see right here is the minimum amount of code that we need to write in order to satisfy Photon's API. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Build Configuration Manager, and I'm going to go Edit, and I'm going to delete debug. Actually, I'm not going to delete debug out of this quite yet. I'm going to go to New, I'm going to create debug-Nelson, and I'm going to copy settings from debug. Then I'm going to go to Edit, and I'm going to delete debug. Okay, so what I've just done is I've essentially renamed the debug configuration into the debug-Nelson configuration. And can anybody guess as to why I might create a build configuration that's specific to the developer that's actually working on this on the program? Now, this scheme of doing things is it's appropriate for smaller teams, but won't be so appropriate for larger teams. But for smaller teams, it's very handy. It's not about personalized debug flags. It's actually about where my server is going to be placed into. Whenever I build, I want to pass or have my DLLs copied into the Photon, the appropriate folder within Photon, which is going to require that my project has some sort of sense as to where Photon is located, which of course isn't something that you would want to do in a multi-developer environment. So to fix that, I kind of created my own build configuration, which again is a perfectly appropriate way to handle this problem for a small development team, but might start to break down a little bit once you start getting bigger. So now that I've created my own debug configuration, I'm going to go into the properties of the project down to build, and I'm going to change its output path. And the output path is going to output into a folder in Photon. Okay, everybody needs to pay attention right now. This is important. Every single Photon application will live underneath the deploy folder. So if I were to I'm creating RuneSlinger in this case, RuneSlinger needs to exist as a folder underneath deploy. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it RuneSlinger. The next important thing is once you've created your folder for your application, you're also going to have to create a binary folder. The binary folder is where your binaries live. So it's fairly aptly named, but that's something you're going to have to do. So create your RuneSlinger folder and then create your bin folder underneath it, and specify this as the folder you want to dump your built assemblies into. Now that I've done that, I'll save out this project file and I'll do a build. Now that I've done a build, by hitting Control-Shift-B, I should be able to jump back into my new RuneSlinger folder under the bin folder, and I see all of my built assemblies, including the runeslinger.server.dll. Now that I've actually created the application within my Photon installation directory, I'm going to go into the Photon configuration and actually tell it about my new application. I'm going to do that kind of by cheating. I'm going to copy and paste one of these application nodes. I'm going to change the name to RuneSlinger. The base directory is RuneSlinger. This base directory corresponds to the folder that we created underneath the deploy folder. The assembly is runeslinger.server. That's because my project name is runeslinger.server, so that must be the name of my assembly as well. The type is going to be the type of our entry point, which I said before was our application. So if I look at the application, it's underneath a namespace called runeslinger.server, which I'll copy and paste here, and it's named application. So these two attributes will give our Photon installation enough information to find, or rather these three attributes, to find our server and to spool up the application. Force auto restart and watch files and exclude files I will talk about later. I just want to go ahead and see this application running. The final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the default application to RuneSlinger. Now I'm going to open up my logs. You should always have your logs open. Clear them so I can keep a close eye on what is about to happen with Photon. And I'm going to restart Photon by right-clicking this little control panel doohickey, go to Photon instance default, hit stop, which notice how it says service shutdown complete. Then I'm going to right-click back on this, default, start. And let's see if it actually works. And it says service shutdown complete, which means it failed. So let's find out what's going on. Application does not exist policy. That's because I nuked these applications, but these applications are actually being referenced at other places. So that's going to require that I comment out this TCP listener field, which again, we're not using TCP, so I don't really mind commenting that out. And then I'm also going to comment out the TCP policy listeners element as well. Then I'm also going to comment out the WebSocket listeners, and that should be good. Again, I like having a clean configuration file to where Photon isn't trying to spool up a bunch of applications that I'm not using. And this will also remove the amount of ports that Photon's going to bind to on my network interface. Next up, I'm going to actually try to launch Photon again. And let's see what happens. Again, you guys are going on an adventure with me. Hey, service is running. Let's see. Application RuneSlinger started in app domain 2. So, that means it was able to instantiate our class, load up our DLL, and didn't choke because we were using .NET 4.5. So that's all good stuff. So I think about now is a good time, now that I've actually done quite a few different things, and it's been about an hour, I think it's a good time to take a little break and people post questions. If you guys are following along and having difficulties, go ahead and post questions and I'll respond to them when we get back. And then when we get back, I'll go ahead and talk about these other elements within our application node and get some logging of our own going inside of our application.
Awesome.
So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video. Okay, so we're back. We did have a problem over break. Somebody says that when they try to compile their application, they're getting an error about not being able to find system.web. Now, the reason that happens is if you jump into your project.
You did start recording.
So right-click your project.
Okay, good.
Yes. Hit Properties. Jump down to Applicate or up to Application. Make sure that you have selected .NET Framework 4.5. If you select the client profile for either 4 or 3.5, you will get errors saying that it cannot find system.web. That's because the system.web assembly doesn't exist in the client profile. A client profile is a stripped down version of .NET, which is used for making deployments smaller or something like that. I don't even know what the justification is for the client profile because honestly the difference between a full version and a client profile is like 10, 20 megs, which this is like 2013 and 10 and 20 megs isn't a lot. But anyway, okay. So we now have our application, which inherits from the application base class. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get some logging in place. Because like I said before, Unity is headless, so the only way that we're going to be able to see the output of our application is through the log files. So fortunately, I already referenced a log4net assembly that was packaged with exit games. I'm going to use this log4net assembly instead of pulling it down from NuGet because I'm assuming that those exit game libraries are also built against log4net, and I don't want to deal with assembly redirects if the version changes or anything fun like that. There's a lot of DLL hell associated with log4net when dealing with different assemblies that are compiled for different versions and blah, blah, blah. It's not very fun. So to sidestep that entire issue, I'm just going to use the log4net distribution that was provided with the Photon server libraries. So what I need to do is I need to create a log4net config file, and then I also need to in my application setup, I need to tell log4net where that config file is and instantiate the log manager and all that fun stuff. So we'll start off in the setup function, or method, or whatever it is. Which class are we teaching? C#, right? So it's a method. So I'm going to start off.
Don't die on us, Nelson. I hear you choking in the other room.
Sorry, I inhaled a crushed red pepper. Wasn't very pleasant. Okay, so we'll start off bringing up some reference code on my other monitor. We'll start off by, inside of setup, I'm going to tell log4net where it is it needs to load the configuration from. So I'm going to go ahead and say XML configurator .configure and watch. Then I'm going to pass in a file info, which is going to point to where the log4net configuration file is going to be. So I'm going to say new file info. And then for the path of the file info, I'm going to say path.combine binary path, which I'll talk about in a moment, log4net.config. So this just tells log4net to go ahead and configure and watch using the configuration file that's found underneath the binary path combined with log4net.config. Now, binary path is a property that's provided to us by the application base class, and that's just going to point to where our bin folder is. You'll see in a moment when I create the log4net.config, that file is going to be copied into the binary folder of my Photon application. So now that I've done this, I can go ahead and tell exitgames.logging log manager, and I'll talk about this in a second, set logging factory to log4net logger factory.instance. So what I'm doing here is I'm instructing the exit games, they have their own abstraction over log files that they use internally, and I'm just telling their abstraction to take advantage of log4net. Now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and instantiate a logger. So to do that, I'm going to say private static read-only ilog log equals log manager get logger for type of application. The way log4net is configured is that log4net gives you a log pretty well. It's complicated. Actually, don't we have a log4net workshop somewhere on the site where we went through all this stuff? There's a loose correlation between log4net loggers and assemblies and types within .NET. And in this case, all I'm saying is I want basically everything that this log object logs, I want it to be prefixed with the path to this application type. And finally, what I'm going to do down here is say log.info application started. And that'll give us the first bit of output of our program. Next up, I'm going to create the log4net.config file. So I'm going to create a new item. I'm going to go into code file. I'm going to say log4net.config. And inside the log4net.config, it follows a pretty straightforward schema. We're just going to have to say log4net, which is the root element. We'll need two things. We'll need an appender. An appender is going to represent a file that we're going to be logging to. With log4net, we can go ahead and create as many appenders as we want, as many files as we want, or we can pass log messages to a SQL database or whatever fun stuff we come up with. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an appender. This appender is going to have the name of the log file appender, and it's going to have a type of log4net .appender .rolling file appender. Now we will be creating other appenders during the course of this to delineate our logs based off different criteria. For example, once we dump in Hibernate into this project, I'm going to want in Hibernate not to clutter up my main application log. So I'm going to be having that do something else. Then we could redirect Photon log messages to another file and so on. Log4net gives you a lot of flexibility in regards to that. So I'm going to create a param called file. And it's going to have a value. Now this is important. The value is going to be log/runegame.app.log. This just says what file it's going to print to. This path is relative to our deploy folder within the Photon installation. Then I don't believe we need anything else for this. We'll see if it fails on me later. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump in a layout. So it's a layout of type pattern layout. I'm going to give it this pattern. And this is a pattern that I've been just kind of copying and pasting around because I like the way it shows up on the log files. But it's not a required parameter. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my root or set my root element. In this case, again, this is a very simple configuration for log4net. Wow. I cannot type today. Basically what I'm doing here is I'm telling everything that is ever logged with log4net, I want to capture everything that's info or above, and I want it to send those logs into my log file appender. Again, this very, very, very straightforward configuration, bare bones. We'll be expanding this later. Now, the last important thing that I need to do, yeah, I can paste you guys my conversion pattern if you want. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click log4net.config, go to Properties, and set its copy to output directory to copy if newer. What that's going to mean is every time I build, the log4net.config file will be placed in the binary path of our project. So now I'm going to hit Control-Shift-S to save, and because I have Photon already running, when I hit build, something interesting is going to happen. Let me fire up my logs real fast. Because Photon's already running, and I've set my configuration of this application to force auto restart and to watch files and to exclude files, what I've essentially told Photon to do is every time my DLL files change, I want to have Photon automatically reload my application. So when I hit Control-Shift-B, we get some messages from Photon. We get restarting application RuneSlinger due to file changes. Then we get application RuneSlinger restart request, blah, 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 blah. And it started, and then the restart was complete. So now let's see if our log file actually got created. So I'm going to jump over into the deploy folder, into log, and hey, look at that. runegame.app.log was created.
And you had a question, Nelson, which is, does that mean you can hot patch Photon projects?
Yes. Although I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for, well, yeah, it's complicated. You would take advantage of that feature of Photon being able to reload your applications. You would take advantage of that in a production application, but you might want to make that build process a little bit more complicated than just replacing DLL files. The format that I have everything set up to is really appropriate for development, but when you get into production, when you want to do things like send everybody a message that the server's going down in 10 minutes and blah, 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 then things get more complicated. But for now, and for simple production deployments, this is just fine. So I'm going to bring runegame.app.log, and hey, look at this. We have two messages, which brings up the first point. We have our runeslinger.server.application logger said application started, which is what we wanted. But then we have this photon.soccerserver.application base message. That's coming from Photon. I just decided that I don't want any of Photon's log messages to appear inside of my main application log. So let's go ahead and fix that. Inside of my log4net.config, I'm going to copy and paste my appender to create a new appender. And I'm going to change his name to Photon log appender. and I'm going to give it a file of runegame.photon.log. Then what I'm going to do is on the root, I'm going to change the root logger to Photon log file appender, but then I'm going to create another logger called RuneGame. Any configuration I put in this logger element will apply to everything that's logged that starts with RuneSlinger, if I actually spelled RuneSlinger correctly. So, did I do RuneGame up here too? No. I'm changing the logs, by the way, to runeslinger.photon.log. I don't know why I kept on doing RuneGame. That was like the name of the project before, but then I changed it, so now it's getting confused in my head. So now that I have the second logger element, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it to do a few different things. First of all, I'm going to give it a level of info, even though that's redundant, I don't really care. Then I'm going to give it appender ref of my log file appender. Then I'm going to add an attribute to my logger element called additivity, A-D-D-I-T-I-V-I-T-Y, and set it to false. What I've essentially instructed Log4net to do is I want everything that's ever logged to go into the Photon log file appender, except for things that are logged under the RuneSlinger namespace. Anything that's under the RuneSlinger namespace gets logged to my log file appender. So now I'm going to rebuild Control-Shift-B. I'm going to close out the runegame.app.log because I changed the name of that. Jump back into my log file folder. And now I have runeslinger.app.log and runeslinger.photon.log. I'll drag both of these into Log4net. And they're both empty. They're both empty because I failed at doing something. Why are you empty? Oh. What's funny is I just brought up an interesting point. I actually didn't cause RuneSlinger to restart. The reason I didn't is because the only file that changed was the log4net.config, which is an excluded file. I can change log4net.config and that won't trigger a restart for Photon. Now, it did cause those files to be created because Log4net itself was watching for changes, but it didn't cause a restart into Photon. So what you're going to see me do is something that I will do a lot during the course of this. I'm going to jump into my application CS, or really any CS file. I'm going to add a space at the end of the file. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-S and Control-Shift-B. That'll cause the DLLs to be rebuilt, which will trigger a Photon application restart, which is what I wanted to do in the first place. So then I get my runeslinger.photon.log is now printing stuff, and my runeslinger.app.log is kind of empty. Let's figure out why that's still empty. Let's see here. Yeah, there we go. Application started. It just needed a
You just need to poke it harder.
I don't know. Yeah, it needed to hit Control-Shift-B harder. Sometimes you have to do that. Okay, so now we have our application logging correctly, so we have our entire log framework pretty much in place. It's not a whole lot of code to do that stuff. So the last thing that I want to do today, at least last thing I want to accomplish, is to get a Unity project started up and actually get some basic communication between my server and my client. So let's go ahead and, I don't know, let's do something. I'm going to fire up Unity. Let's see what happens when I fire up Unity. This is the first time I fired up Unity on this computer, and this is also the first time I've fired up Unity forever. So again, this is an adventure. Ooh, we get this nice little hello world. I wonder what happens when I hit play. Okay, that's actually really boring. I don't know what I'm looking at. First of all, I'm going to jump into Unity preferences and tell it to show my project wizard every time I start it up. Oh, and by the way, Jason and I have been talking. We are going to be putting together a dark theme for 3D Buzz, but only member sponsors can use it.
Gonna copy Unity.
Copy Unity.
Sorry, that was just funny.
Yep.
Sorry, that was just funny.
The next thing I'm going to do is under External Tools, I'm going to hit Browse, and I'm going to navigate to DevEnv. DevEnv is located under Project Files x86, Microsoft Visual Studio 11, Common 7, IDE, DevEnv. Hit Open, and now our external script editor is, I hate that they use that, whatever, I'm not going to complain, set to Microsoft Visual Studio 2012. So now that this is all done, I'm going to close out of this and launch it again, which it should now bring up my project wizard. And apparently, I do have a project on my computer. I don't remember. Well, it's under Visual Studio 20. How did it know? I don't know. I don't know. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pin it to my taskbar. I'm going to create a new project. Now, where I'm placing this project is going to be important. So I'm going to find that MMO dev class RuneSlinger project that we created before. Keep in mind that this is going to be the root of our Git repository when I set up source control, which I'll actually probably end up doing today. And inside of this, we have our lib and our Visual Studio folder, but I also want a Unity folder. And our Unity folder is where I'm going to place the Unity project. So I'm going to hit Select Folder, and then I'm going to hit Create. So now let me, whoa. Project folder is different looking. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save my scene. So under Unity Assets, I'm going to create a new folder called Scenes. And I'm going to call this Scene 1 because I lack all forms of creativity. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to use external source control. So that's going to be under File Project Settings, Editor, Version Control, Metafiles. So if you want to use source control with Unity, make sure that you have selected metafiles. What that essentially does is it makes your library folder no longer responsible for containing all the metadata associated with your assets. Instead, your assets will be accompanied by a corresponding metafile, which is in plain text and can be merged properly. So now that I've created everything, let's go ahead and create like a game manager or something. Again, this new project window is freaking me out. How do I make it like it used to be? There we go. That's better. Now I'm going to move it over here. And console, I'll leave the console down there. Animation, I'll close that window because I don't need it. And this should be fine. Okay, so now I have my scenes. I'm going to create another folder called Code. Inside of this, I'm just going to create a C# script, quote unquote, and I'm going to call it Game Manager. Game Manager. And I'm going to fire it up. Eventually. And hey, it actually started up. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is actually change, because I screwed up when I actually typed in Game Manager, I typed in Game Manage. I'm going to make that change correspond to my class. And then I'm going to make this code less ugly. Finally, I'm going to make these public. The reason I make these public is so that ReSharper doesn't tell me to delete them. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to bring in the Unity or the Photon Unity build, and then I need to, well, connect to Photon. So what I first need to do is jump back into my Explorer window, jump into here, jump into RuneSlinger, Unity, Assets. Now, underneath this Assets folder, I'm going to create another folder called Assemblies. Inside of Assemblies, I'm going to dump the Unity Photon or client SDK, which I previously downloaded, and it's right here, Photon Unity 3D. I'm going to bring in libs, release, Photon 3 Unity 3D. What's in the debug? We get a PDB if we can do the debug. So let's do a debug for now. We'll move over to release later. Now, the fun thing about what I just did is I copied some DLLs into the assets path of my Unity installation. Now, at first, you won't notice anything different with my solution. But if I jump back into Unity, what Unity is going to do is it's going to pick up those file changes, and then it's going to update the CS proj of my Visual Studio project to reference those assemblies. So now you see the solution Unity C# has been modified, but all I did was jump back into Unity. When I jumped back into Unity and gave it focus, it decided, oh wait, I have to rescan the assets directory. It rescanned the assets directory, found the DLLs, added them to CS proj, and then jumping back to Visual Studio caused Visual Studio to say, oh, the CS proj changed, do you want to reload it? So I always hit yes. Now the biggest thing that changed is if I open up my references, we now have Photon 3 Unity 3D added as a reference. So remember, when working with Photon, your Visual Studio project, you cannot make changes to it. You cannot add references to it or do anything to it really other than edit code files. That's because Unity likes to delete and recreate the CS proj whenever it feels like it, and it will do things like automatically add references to assemblies you placed in and automatically add the file paths and everything like that. So don't ever do anything in Visual Studio. Don't ever add references. You can generally get away with adding in assets as long as... it's complicated. I'm not going to get into this. Stuff and things. If it breaks, just close Visual Studio, go to Unity, tell it to sync the mono-develop project, and jump back into Visual Studio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a reference to a class that we're going to be using as our connection into Photon. Now this one happens to be called Photon Peer because I couldn't make things non-confusing. So I'm going to do private Photon Peer, Then in start, I'm going to instantiate it. So we need to pass in a Photon Peer listener and a connection protocol. So I'm going to pass in this as the Photon Peer listener for now, and as the connection protocol, I'm going to select UDP. Now this is going to cause a problem because the class that I'm currently in doesn't actually implement iPhoton Peer listener. So let's go ahead and make it. So I'm going to add iPhoton Peer listener, and then I'm going to add an implementation for the 4 methods that you have to implement when implementing iPhoton Peer listener. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to connect. So I'm going to say photonpeer.connect. Server address is 127.0.0.1 or localhost. I always feel cooler typing in 127.0.0.1. And then the application name is going to be RuneSlinger. And it has a Boolean. So I'm going to say if not, then debug log error could not connect to Photon, and so on. Then on updates, I'm going to do Photon Peer dot service. Photon Peer dot service will actually tell the Photon Peer to do its stuff, so that's always fun. And then the last thing I'm going to do is a method that I completely forgot about. I can't remember what the name of that thing is. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? It's called like onApplicationQuit or something, I believe. See, the problem, I've already complained about this stuff all the time, but I hate these stupid magic methods that just happen to correspond with something that Unity will pick up. These really should be overrides or an implementation of interface members, because then every single time I have to figure out, okay, I want to handle this event that does this thing, I have to go into the documentation and actually find it out again for the upteenth millionth time. On application quit. photonpeer.disconnect. So there we go. Now we have our basic game manager. So now I'm going to jump back into the RuneSlinger project, and whenever we create a peer, I'm going to say log.info format peer created at init request.remote IP. And seriously, init request.remote port, and then :1. So this will just log a nice little message every time we connect, just so we can see, are we really actually connecting to Unity? Or is Unity really connecting to Photon? So now I'm going to move this over off screen for now, and I'm going to build it, which is going to cause my logs, hopefully, to tell us that we started, which I can't remember if that's the old message or the new message. I'm going to go ahead and clear the log and build again. Build harder. Yep, application started. So now our application has been reloaded into Unity. Then I'm going to drag my game manager onto my camera. And I'm going to make sure my console is open, which it is down here. I'm going to move my logs over up to the top of the monitor just so I can pay attention to them while I launch this, and let's see what happens. Argument out of range, cannot be negative. Parameter length, what? What does that even mean? Server address. Does it want a port or something? What does it want? What does it want from me? It wants something. We figure out what it wants. Yeah, I think it wants a port. So let's pass in a port. 5055. Okay, so now let's jump back into Unity and hit start and see what happens. Hey, you guys want to see something sexy? Look at that. Come on, does anybody think that's cool? I think it's cool. All right, let's do something a little bit more fun. I'm going to bring over my my application. On teardown, I'm going to say log.info application ending. And then on my peer class, my Rune peer, I'm going to print out a log message every time a peer is disconnected. And I'm going to move this log message from this logger into a new logger I'm going to create over here. So I'm going to say private static go away solution explorer. This is why I wanted to work at full resolution, by the way. Read only ilog log equals log manager get logger type of Rune peer. Then I'm going to move this over to here. And then on disconnect, I'm going to say log.info format peer disconnected. Okay, so now I have a little bit more verbose logging so I can actually watch these a little bit nicer. So I just rebuilt. I'm going to wait for the application to start. Remember, that's the most important thing about this log message right here. This application started is you're going to want to wait until you get an application started before you start playing with your application. But for some reason, my application isn't starting. Which means my old application is still running, which means that's not what I want. Okay, so now my application has really been started. So now I can bring over Unity, hit play, and we get a peer created. Hit stop, and we get a peer disconnected. So before we move on to source control, I'm going to go ahead and put in something really simple. I'm going to just put in like an echo chamber type application. On my game manager, on GUI. So tell me this, somebody. Why is this called update and this called on GUI? Why isn't this just called GUI, or why isn't this called on update? Anyone? Yeah, I don't think so. Okay, I'm going to tell ReSharper
All right, that was good.
add GUI to the abbreviation list. So on GUI, I'm going to go ahead and make a button and text box. So I'm going to say private string message. I'm going to initialize message to empty string, otherwise GUI will throw a fit, or Unity will throw a fit. I'll say GUI dot text field message equals GUI text field new rect 00. Let's do 240. Passing in message as the text. Then I'm going to say if GUI button new rect 045. How about 140? And then say send message. And then in this case, I'm going to say send. Well, obviously I can't do that, but send server message, implement this method just to keep things a little bit cleaner. Then send server message. Okay, so now that we have Photon peer and our Photon peer is connected, I can now do Photon peer dot op custom. Now, op custom is the method that will cause Photon to send a message to my server. Now, we have a bunch of fun stuff we can do here, but all I'm going to worry about is I'm going to worry about the opcode, which I'm going to set to 0. The custom op parameters is going to be a dictionary that I'll fill in a moment, and the send reliable is going to be set to true. Then just to make things a little bit, I'm going to format this code a little bit nicer so I can break this out like this. And then the first, there we go. And then I'll do that. And then I'm also, every time I send a message, I'm going to clear my message and set it to blank again. Okay, so now all I'm doing is I'm sending Photon a message with an operation code of 0 and with a dictionary that contains one string at the 0th key. So now I'm going to jump back into Photon. So my RuneSlinger application, that method is going to correspond to the onOperation request. So on the client, we hit op custom. And then on the server, what happens is Photon does all its serialization stuff and packet reliability goodness and all that fun stuff. Then it ends up at this method on the server. So now we can say, I'm going to say if operation request dot operation code does not equal 0, I'm going to consider this to be a failed message. So I'm going to say log.warn format peer sent unknown opcode of bleh operation request operation code return. Then I'm going to process this code. In this case, all I'm going to do is say log.debug format got message from client bleh. Now what's bleh? Bleh is going to be operation request dot parameters at 0 casted to a string. Remember, I sent that dictionary with that string as the element with at the 0th key. What that ends up being turned into is this parameters dictionary that gets sent on the server. So I'm going to build this. So Control-Shift-B. I'm going to wait to see application started, because if I don't wait to see application started, then I'll be working with an older, out-of-date application. And it really doesn't... There we go. Application started. Then I'm going to jump into Unity, hit play. I'm going to move Unity over off to the right, and I'm going to watch the log. So I'm going to type in a message, hit send message, and nothing happens. Blame Jeff. So let's find out why nothing happens. If I jump over first, well, no, yes. If I jump back into my Unity project, That's not my Unity project. Hold on, my computer's being kind of slow right now. So photonpeer.opcustom did get sent. Zero message. Let me try 1. I wonder if the operation code of 0 is reserved. Hit Control-Shift-B. Take a look at my logs. Application ending. Yeah, something's going weird with my Photon server. I'm going to go ahead and kill it and start it back up again. Ooh, I just got a warning sound from my computer and I have no idea where it came from. I told everyone this would be an adventure. That's going to be my excuse for everything, every time something goes wrong. So I just hit start application. Let's see what happens. Service is running. If I go into RuneSlinger to app, application started. So let's jump into Unity, hit play. Peer connected. And no message received, nothing in the console. And client disconnect. So that's interesting. Obviously something's going wrong. Let's see here. So if I jump into RunePeer, I do have the on-operation request code right there, which should be fairly straightforward. Let's try the opposite for now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send an event to the peer and see if the peer can actually receive the event. So I'm going to say send event with event data, event code of 0, a new dictionary of byte an object, and then with the send parameters of unreliable set to false. Then I'm going to set 0. Whoa. So after I send an event, I can go ahead and handle on event, and I can say debug log event data dot parameters 0.toString.
And take a look over in BuzzNet as well.
Do you need a yes, I do need the message equals message. That's for Unity's UI thing. Should be info format. I'm using debug format. Oh, are you kidding me? If this turns out what it is, I'm going to throw myself off a bridge. Okay, well apparently I forgot log4net. In log4net, debug is actually above info. So I want to set this level to debug. Or, instead of doing that, I can go back and, well, actually I do want to set this to debug. I forgot that it went debug info warn error fatal. I thought it was info debug warn fatal error. So now that I've set this to debug, I'll be able to move this back into debug format and hit Control-Shift-B. Hit Control-Shift-B harder. Application started good. Restart Photon, or restart Unity. And here we go. Okay, so that was my embarrassment for the day. Everybody understand what went wrong, right? Does everybody kind of get? It was actually working. The problem was I set my log4net to ignore debug messages. That's all that was wrong with that code. So it was working the entire time, actually. So, and you guys got a bit of foreshadowing with the send event code. But I'm going to go ahead and delete the send event stuff because that was just for testing. And then I'm going to put it back in on over here. So what happens when the peer sends that message is I want to get a list of all currently connected peers, and I want to send them all the message that I received. So to do that, I need a collection of all the connected peers. And so I'm going to go into application.cs, and I'm going to create a private read-only list of Rune peer called peers. In the constructor, which I don't have yet, which I now have, I'm going to instantiate my peers collection. And then inside of create peer, I'm going to alias that out into a variable peers. Sorry, I'm suffering some really, really bad lag in Visual Studio. There we go. That took a lot longer than it should have. But all I'm doing now is just having a list of peers that I'm doing and stuff. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a public void, how about destroy peer, rune peer, which simply does peers dot remove peer. Then the last thing I'm going to do in application for now is second to last thing is I'm going to pass in an instance of application into my Rune peer. So what that did is it added a application parameter, which I'm going to have set to a read-only field on my peer. So I'm just passing the application into the peer. So we have this awesome circular dependency fun stuff. But again, I'm being careful with this. We shouldn't get any memory leaks from this code. Then I'm going to have, final thing is I'm going to expose an IEnumerable of Rune peer called peers, which just returns peers. Now, I know that this isn't the most amazing code ever. It's kind of horrible, but this will allow us to really quickly test to see if our application is working between multiple clients. And keep in mind that I'm not building this Rune game from a heavy framework forward. Instead, I'm going to make things as simple as possible and then factor things out as we go along. So, yep. Finally, to fix up our Rune peer, I'm going to have to do a couple things. When we get the disconnect message, I'm going to have invoke application.destroy peer, which will remove it from the peers list. Then, on the operation request, I'm going to get the message, and I'm going to say for each var peer in application peers. Well, I could put this in a thing. That wouldn't look too bad, would it? Where t does not equal this. Peer.sendEvent. Now, sendEvent is basically the server-side version of on or up custom. SendEvent will send a message back to the peer, or to a peer. What it wants is an event data and a send parameters. The event data, I'm going to instantiate a new event data class. I'm going to pass in 0 as the event code, and then I'm going to pass in a new instantiation of a dictionary of byte and object, which should look familiar because it's the exact same stuff that we did before with our op custom. Then, as a second parameter, I'm going to pass in a new instantiation of send parameters with unreliable set to false. And then I'm going to format this code to look a little bit nicer. So all I'm doing is to every single peer that's in the program except for us, I'm going to pass in or send an event to them telling them that a message has been received. However, I'm going to factor this event data outside of the for each loop. Sorry, it's just a little OCD thing. I don't want to instantiate a new object every single iteration of the loop because it's really unnecessary. So I'm just going to instantiate these objects outside of the loop, which this is a micro optimization which will make absolutely no difference in the final product, but at least makes my code look like it's performance conscious. Okay, so now all our server does is whenever we get a message from the client, we just turn around and send that message to every other client. So that's pretty straightforward. The next thing I'm going to have to do is inside of Unity, or my Unity Visual Studio project, I'm going to implement the onEvent. And onEvent, all that's going to do is print out, I'm going to be lazy, debug.log message blank event data. Nah, I won't be lazy because I'm going to be doing an external build. So inside of Game Manager, I'm going to have a private list of string called messages. I'm going to instantiate that in the start method. Then every time onEvent is fired, I'm going to do messages.add event data parameters at 0.toString. Then on my onGUI, I'm going to say GUI.label new rect 0. What's 45 plus 40? 85 plus 5 is 90. With the width of, let's do 300 and a height of 500. And I'm going to pass in string.join new line messages. So that's just going to... Okay, this is going to really frustrate me. We're currently building against .NET 3.5, which means we don't have a implementation of string.join that accepts an IEnumerable of string. So we have to say dot as a or am I getting confused? Yeah, it wants an array. Dot to array. There we go. And yes, every onGUI I'm now instantiating a new array. But that's just how it's going to have to be because the string.join method's dumb. So now that we have all this stuff, we should be seeing messages if we have multiple Unity clients running at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control B, which is going to bring up my build settings, and I'm going to build out a PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. Let's go ahead and give it the architecture of x86, target platform, Windows, and I'm going to say build. Now this is important. It's going to pop up a window asking me where I want the build to go. I'm going to hit back into RuneSlinger, right-click, new folder, and type in build. This is very important. The reason this is important is I want to ignore this folder inside of my source control or inside of my repository. And to do that, it needs to be in a predictable location. But I don't want to have, personally, I don't want to have builds all over my computer. I want it to be consolidated into this one folder. So I'm just going to do that. And then the file name is going to be RuneSlinger. I'm going to hit save. And we're building. And we've built. So now I should be able to run this, hit play. And I think I actually forgot to build my server. So let me go ahead and build my server now. If my computer could stop lagging. Control-Shift-B, application ending, but of course I'm not going to get another application started until I hit Control-Shift-B again for some weird reason. I'll figure that out later. And then once I have that done, I should now be able to jump into my build, which that isn't the right folder. Unity, Control-B, so now I have a Unity build going. Then let's hit play in the editor, and let's see what happens when I send a message. Absolutely nothing. Oh. Does anybody know, or does anybody not know why those messages didn't appear until I focused on the window? Yeah, need to run in background. Yep, sorry about that, guys. That was just a slight derpage on my part. Let me jump into File, Build Settings, Player Settings, Inspector, and then run in background. So now that I've hit run in background, I can hit Control B. And let's go ahead and hit Control B again. And get an error because I'm already running. Hold on, I just completely screwed up my build by trying to run it. Wow. Hold on. Control B, load that up, wait for it to load. Then I'm going to jump into RuneSlinger, build RuneSlinger.exe, play, RuneSlinger.exe, play, and let's do one more. And now I have the most boring application we possibly could have made with Photon. Okay, so how's everyone feeling? I know it's not all that exciting, but we did a lot of really important stuff to get this to where we are right now. BuzzNet 2.0. Yeah. Alrighty, so to wrap up today, I want to go ahead and get this project into source control. And if you ask me why I want to get this project into source control, then you are no longer allowed to attend this class. But yeah, so I want this into source control. I want to go ahead and put this into a Git repository. I want to have that Git repository on GitHub. So let me go ahead and start doing that. First thing I'm going to do is off screen, I'm going to create a new private Git repository. If I can. I think we're almost out of repositories, Jason.
Oh, are we really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're out. Hold on, I have to remove one of these. I can remove CGS. No. Sorry, guys. Just give me one moment. So the future people don't have to suffer. And we're back. So now that I've created the repository, I'm going to go ahead and clone it onto my local computer. So I'm going to fire up SmartGit. And I'm going to go ahead and clone, paste in the path to this, which this is a private repository, and so none of you will be able to get in if you tried to access that through that path. Choose, where am I going to dump this? Dump this on our MMO, oops, wrong one, dev class, RuneSlinger, next, open in current project. So now that we have RuneSlinger.get, unfortunately one of the annoying behaviors of SmartGit is it's going to actually, I believe, it's going to create, yeah. So let me go ahead and remove this from SmartGit. Remove repository. Then I'm going to take this .git folder and paste it one above, delete the RuneSlinger.get. I have no idea if that's the most efficient way to do what I just did, but it works. Then I'm going to hit Project, Open Repository, and then I'm going to just open this entire folder as a repository, hit Next, Open in Current Project, and now I have RuneSlinger. Okay, so now we have a bunch of stuff that Git is going to try to add to the repository. But fortunately, we don't need most of this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and bring over a git ignore, and I'm going to slightly cheat and pull in a git ignore from an existing project that is structured in a very similar way. If I can remember. Yep. I'll just pull over the git ignore from CGS because it was structured very similarly. And this is what my git ignore looks like. So we are ignoring things like the build folder, which if you recall is where my builds go, my Unity library folder, which is not needed because I'm using the meta files, and then Unity assets underscore assemblies. We'll talk about what that is momentarily or at a later time. Or I might even change that path, I don't know. And then a bunch of Visual Studio files, a bunch of tooling files, a bunch of project files, a bunch of Subversion files, and our Office temp files. And also, I don't want to ignore Unity assets assemblies, but I do want to ignore Unity assembly. I do want to ignore assembly C#. And RuneSlinger -C# and Unity.slin and Unity-C#.slin. I'm sure there's a better way to do this, but whatever. There we go. So that's my git ignore. Now that I have the git ignore in there, I can jump back into Git, and most of those files disappear. The only files that should be left are the ones that I want to add to the repository. So what do we have? We have our Visual Studio RuneSlinger.server.properties. We have our server code. We have our slins. We have our Unity project settings. We have our Unity scene. We have our game manager. We have our assets. We have our library files. And we have our git ignore. So really, this is all we need to add into source control. Everything else are just temporary files that we don't want. So I'm going to commit. I'm going to call this initial commit and commit and push. Jump back over to GitHub and make sure it made its way into the project. And it did. We now have our Unity project and our auxiliary code project and our Photon code project all under source control. So yeah. I think that's about it for today. I mean, we got Photon running, we configured Photon, we created a Photon application, we hooked it up with Unity, we got into source control. A lot of good, really important stuff to understand when working with applications like this. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and step out for a few minutes, and if anybody wants to ask any questions, now's the time to do it. And when we get back, I'll kill the video if there's nothing more to talk about. So I'll be right back. Alrighty. And we're back. So, Nelson, would it be doable to manage the code through Mono if we don't have Visual Studio? And if we wanted to use NGUI, provided we have it, are there any issues with doing so? No, I mean, if you want to use MonoDevelop, that's fine. Obviously, I'm going to be making heavy use of Visual Studio and ReSharper throughout this class, but code is code is code. You could use Notepad if you're masochistic and wanted to. So yeah, go ahead and use MonoDevelop if that's what you have, or if that's what you're comfortable with. Obviously, I would recommend Visual Studio and ReSharper, because those are the tools that I use, and everybody knows the tools that I use are the best tools to use. But there's nothing stopping you from using MonoDevelop. That'll work just fine. As far as NGUI, yeah, go ahead and use it if you want to. Most of this class, at least the first part of this class, is going to be focused on the server side. So starting up next week, we're going to start building out the server to where it can handle, multiple rooms, lobbies, games, challenges, stuff like that. And again, the server code, as it matures, is going to become the base for the MMO once that project actually get started. But the good thing about working with RuneGame is that we have very few concerns client-side. Most of the concerns are going to be server-side. So that gives us a nice little playground to go through all these concepts and get some framework code in place that we can reuse later. So this stuff is going to be pretty much a requirement to go through the MMO, because once we start that project, I'll be reusing a lot of the code that's going to be built here in this part. Alrighty. So yeah, is that about it? Does the object in the event parameter have to be serializable? I'll be honest, I have not looked into the way Photon does serialization. I do believe, yes, Dragagon or Christian says yes, it does need to be serializable. That being said, we won't be taking large amounts of advantage of the built-in Photon serialization just because I have certain ways that I like to serialize data that allow me to take advantage of things like class hierarchies and polymorphic types, as opposed to just working with simple primitives. So yeah. For RuneSlinger, are you going to do any load balancing? No. We're not going to be worrying about load balancing for RuneSlinger. So if that's about it, I guess it's time to say farewell to all the future people.
Nope.
Jason, you have
Except
anything?
next week things should start getting much more fun.
What does anybody?
Things will be coming much
So what?
more interesting next week.
What are you talking about? This is interesting. This is like the base of everything. Everything that we write is going to be based off what we've put together today. So, come on. Alrighty, so I guess that's about it for this week, and we'll see all
Awesome.
you guys
Bye,
later.
everyone.
So,
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
bye.